Hi everyone, welcome or welcome back to Misinformation in Science and Society. Here to listen, not to judge. I'm your host Annie, and today with us we have Paul Barrett. All right, so welcome. Could you please introduce yourself a little bit and what you do?
Sure. My name is Paul Barrett, and I am the Deputy Director of the Center for Business and Human Rights, which is part of the Stern School of Business at New York University. And I've been with the center for almost 6 years now. And for more than 30 years before that, I was a journalist, primarily with the Wall Street Journal, and also at Bloomberg Businessweek magazine. And I've done a lot of writing for newspapers, magazines, and I've written several books as well.
Yeah, awesome. So, could you share with us like your journey to becoming the deputy director of the center, and also what's like kind of like your favorite part of doing what you do?
Sure. Uh, well, after uh, doing journalism on a daily or weekly basis, and really all journalism now is on a 24-hour basis, because even if you're nominally working at a weekly magazine, the magazine's website, of course, is running all the time. So as you can imagine, after more than 3 decades of doing that, I was a little bit, kind of tired of the routine. And I heard about a job at NYU, at the business school. And I was quite familiar with NYU because I had taught at the school, at the law school of NYU, since 2008 as an adjunct professor. So I was already familiar with NYU, and liked the academic environment and enjoyed interacting with younger people, as you are able to if you teach or do research around younger people. So I went in for an interview for this job, and it turned out that the director of the Center for Business and Human Rights was particularly looking for someone who had journalistic experience to kind of step up the writing program of the center. And so I guess I fit the bill, and I was offered the job, and I took it, decided it might be nice to try something new. And upon taking the job, I then learned that the main thing my boss, a guy whose name is Michael Posner, who's a professor at the business school, that what he really wanted me to look into was the social media industry. This was 2017, in the wake of the 2016 presidential election, when it was just becoming clear in 2017 there had been interference in the election by Russian operatives who had been pretending to be American account holders on platforms like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube, and had made a concerted effort to sort of divide and inflame the American electorate with dis and misinformation. So even though I didn't really have a background in writing a lot about technology and was not a huge personal technology user myself, not one of my hobbies to post on Facebook, I quickly began to learn about the social media industry, and then began writing what has become a series of reports or white papers on various aspects of how technology interacts with democracy. And central to all of that is the question of how does technology amplify the spread of falsehoods, whether they are known falsehoods or just misinformation that people spread inadvertently. So that's been central to the research and the writing that I've done while at NYU.
Yeah. So how do you define like the role of business in upholding like human rights, and what should corporations prioritize to like ensure they meet their human rights like obligations?
Right. Right. Well, that's a good question, and it is central to the part of the human rights movement that our center is part of. We focus on business and human rights as opposed to the traditional focus, which is on actually government behavior and how governments oppress or otherwise mistreat individuals. Our focus is on how corporate conduct can result in human rights violations. And in the context of the technology industry, we're talking about values, human rights values, such as free and fair elections, the right to express oneself and to gain access to the expression of other people. Those are really central to all other human rights. If you can't get information about what's going on around you, if you can't express yourself, whether it's expressing enthusiasm for people who are in charge or expressing dissent, complaining about those who are in charge. So in that sense, since large technology companies now have such a central role in how people communicate, how they express themselves, how they learn about the world, how they figure out what they're going to do in connection with a given election or other political activity, the policies and the practices of those technology companies that build and maintain these platforms is central. And our approach to all this is that the companies have the primary responsibility for making sure that they do not interfere with democratic institutions or democratic norms, sort of the values that lie behind our institutions. Institutions being things like elections, campaigns, the ability to gain information about political candidates, to hear them debate each other, access to the free press, to people who are professional observers and analysts of civic life. So we put the primary impetus on the companies, but unfortunately, in this area, as in many other areas, the companies in question have not done the job fully themselves. And so we've also turned our attention to what government can do in this area. That's a very delicate question because while there is a role for government to some degree, we want to be very careful about following the First Amendment, which is the very wise restriction on governments that says that governments, generally speaking, should not regulate speech, should not interfere with an individual's ability to express him or herself. So since the companies in questions are in the speech business, they're in the business of providing a venue for speech, government has to be very careful about how it goes about regulating their conduct.
Yeah. So in your experience, what are some common like misconceptions or pieces of misinformation around business and human rights, like jointly?
Okay. Well, I think one misperception, very, very broadly speaking, is that the protection of human rights is always diametrically opposed to the profitable operation of companies. There tends to be for example, when I first took this job and told friends of mine that, oh, I'm now working for an outfit called the Center for Business and Human Rights, people said, well, that sounds like an oxymoron. What do you mean a Center for Business and Human Rights? Those things are opposed to one another. And sure, it is true that in many instances, businesses are not necessarily devoting themselves to promoting or protecting human rights. But at the same time, I think it's important to understand that if you, for example, are running a factory that's making clothing someplace in Asia, and the clothing is being sold to a global company someplace in the West, which stamps its label on the clothing and then sells it, that it's not necessarily the case that treating those workers in a humane way, paying them a living wage with which they can feed themselves and their family, find shelter and the other necessities of life, that is directly counter to the economic interests of the Western company that's buying the clothing. Because by treating the workers well, you'll build worker loyalty, you'll have happier and more effective workers who potentially will be far more productive. And if they are able to express themselves and point out problems with how the factory is operating, they may actually be able to both improve their own situation and point out ways that the factory can operate more effectively. So I think that is one big misconception, that it's a zero-sum game, that treating workers well, or for that matter, protecting the environment, being decent to the community around which the corporate activity is taking place, that all of that is at odds with the interests of the company. I think a second big misconception is that regulation by the government is necessarily at odds with, again, is sort of a zero-sum game with corporate activity. And I think a great illustration of that we're in the midst of right now is environmental regulation of the automobile industry, which has gradually lowered the ceiling on which the ceiling of allowed carbon emissions, which has made cars less polluting in connection with climate change, but also began to create an incentive for someone to figure out how to make a car run without a gasoline combustion engine. And sure enough, the appearance of the electrical vehicle industry is the big story in the car business, and is in large part an outgrowth of the regulation that gradually made it more expensive to produce traditional gasoline burning cars. So there's an illustration of government regulation actually spurring innovation, not necessarily putting a damper on the overall profits available in a given sector. In connection with technology and communication, I think there's a very big misunderstanding of what the very idea of free speech is. Now that might sound strange because free speech seems like a sort of a self-defining term, but far too often people misunderstand what the First Amendment does in the United States and what interests we're trying to serve. The First Amendment is a limitation on government regulation of speech. It does not restrict what a given, say, company that runs a platform, it does not restrict the decisions that platform might make. So when people say that, well, Facebook is interfering with my First Amendment rights, that's not quite right. It's great if Facebook has a general goal of promoting free expression. That's a central part of American culture. It's a central part of culture in Europe and many other parts of the world. Mm-hmm. But the constitutional rule that government shouldn't interfere with speech does not prevent a given host of speech from setting their own rules. In other words, we build this platform, we welcome people to say a lot of things and exchange a lot of ideas, but we don't want people on our platform to say racist things. We don't want people on our platform to attack other people based on their ethnicity or their country of origin or their sexual orientation or their gender. Those are just our rules. We don't think that's a good, healthy way to express yourself. That kind of restriction by a private company is perfectly appropriate and is not a violation of the First Amendment, as you sometimes hear people complain. And really the response to it is, if you don't like those limitations, if you do want to express anti-Semitic ideas or misogynistic ideas, well, go someplace else to express them. But on that platform, they have certain policies and they want to enforce them. So those are a few misconceptions that come to mind.
Yeah. So in what ways do you think the pandemic has altered like the landscape of business and human rights, and what lessons can like businesses like learn from this?
Yeah. Well, in the technology sphere, the pandemic was central to causing companies that own and operate social media platforms to step away from a kind of an excuse or a defense that they had used previously for not being particularly aggressive about dealing with mis and disinformation. Historically, these companies had rolled out sort of a reflexive response anytime somebody said, well, why do you have so many falsehoods, so much lying going on your, and they would say, well, that's not our business. We don't want to be arbiters of the truth. Okay, that has a certain surface appeal. You don't want employees of a particular company to be making constant judgments about who's telling the truth, who's not telling the truth. In the ordinary course of life, that may make a lot of sense. After all, how could you possibly have enough people to make it all those judgments about people saying nasty things about each other or making things up? I don't like my neighbor across the street. He leaves his garbage cans in the middle of the street, and he says, no, those aren't my garbage cans. They're too trivial to get involved with. Mm-hmm. But with the onset of a lethal pandemic and, thousands and thousands of people dying from this pandemic on a weekly basis across the United States and around the world, even more so, the technology companies that host social media platforms were forced to confront the question, do we want to be part of an effort to undermine a public health policy that encourages people to wear masks? Do we want to be part of an effort to undermine the government's message, its public health policy, that people need to get vaccinated once a vaccine was arrived at? And they realized that, no, we don't want to be part of that. People can have their own views, even if those views lead to other people dying because they don't get vaccines, or them dying themselves because they don't get vaccines. Other people can fail to take a simple public health step like wearing a mask when they're in proximity of other people in the midst of a pandemic. But we don't want to amplify those ideas. So the platforms, to a significant degree, began either labeling conspiracy theories about vaccinations, taking down some material, and began pointing users of the platforms to authoritative sources for information on these topics, so that if you search for material about vaccination, you would be less likely to find conspiracy theories saying that vaccinations are actually bad for you, or similar material, and you would get a little message that said, for authoritative information, you can click on this link and you'll go to the CDC's website and you can peruse information about vaccination there, or the Mayo Clinic's website, or your local hospital system's website, what have you. So that's one big way that the pandemic affected sort of the mindset and the sense of responsibility that major social media platforms had. Now, I think the pandemic affected the way a lot of other businesses and other industries behave themselves in roughly analogous ways. But in those other instances, you are less likely to have the core of what the business does affected, because social media platform is about expressing yourself. That's what it's all about. Whereas the car industry, they're selling cars. They're not necessarily talking about vaccines.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I know you wrote a report about called false accusations and stuff. So could you share your perspective on the role of maybe academic institutions like the NYU Stern Center, Business and Human Rights in combating misinformation around these topics?
Sure. The report that you referred to, which came out in February of 2021, was an analysis of the claim by political conservatives that social media platforms were systematically biased against conservatives, that they were censoring conservatives in a concerted, purposeful, organized way. And I argued that there was no evidence of such a systematic effort. And in fact, what evidence existed pointed in the opposite direction, that in fact, the platforms had been bending and in some cases breaking their own rules to favor conservative voices out of fear that otherwise they would get a big backlash from conservative activists. So we could talk more about that if you want to. But meanwhile, the broader role that you asked about in terms of academic researchers, I think it depends on what the expertise or the skills of the given research center or individual researcher are. Let me explain that. So I have colleagues at NYU who are political scientists who are interested in these same issues. I also have colleagues who are computer scientists who are interested in these issues. Each of them can bring to bear very particular skills in analyzing certain types of data and publishing their findings in a certain manner. And each can contribute to an effort to analyzing a set of problems, much like if you imagine a large orchestra where people play lots of different instruments, but all the instruments together kind of contribute to better understanding, if that analogy works. So the political scientists are in a position to analyze questions such as has the activity of social media platforms exacerbated political polarization? Polarization being the sense that your political opponents are not just wrong about a given issue that you disagree about. Taxes should be higher or lower. But instead, the idea is that the two political groups see each other as enemies of democracy itself, as basically inherently dangerous to the republic. And when you have that type of animosity across partisan lines, there are a number of bad secondary effects for society at large. One of them being it becomes difficult to compromise politically, so it becomes difficult to pass legislation, so that your legislative body may basically come to an impasse and be dysfunctional. Another potential offshoot of high levels of polarization might be that people on both sides of the debate begin to distrust the functioning of democracy at all, so that they may be less likely to bother to vote because they think voting is in some way rigged to favor the other side. So you get cynicism, erosion of trust, and other bad effects. Well, the political scientists are expert at analyzing that problem and can make certain deductions from how social media platforms operate based on certain kinds of data to come to conclusions about the connection between social media, political polarization. The computer scientists, meanwhile, are expert at the inner workings of the software and how it interacts with other systems, and can analyze things from that perspective. Someone like me comes at this as a journalist, or you might say policy analyst, and plays more of a synthetic role. So I go to each of these sets of experts, try to find their central findings, and weave those together into an overall understanding of what the problem is and what we might do to address it. So again, that's more using techniques of journalists, or the kind of fact gathering that legislative aides do on behalf of politicians, and you seek a synthesis and sort of an overall conclusion. Obviously, that last function is the one that I try to use. So I don't pretend to do basic research looking at huge data sets of posts on social media platforms, or when I write about artificial intelligence, which is a whole other topic that I've come to look at lately. I don't look at the data sets that are used to train artificial intelligence models, but I read the studies by people who do know how to do that and try to amalgamate that and pull it all together and say, here's the overall sense of what's going on. So I think those are some of the roles that academic-based researchers can play, and they're very different roles depending on what the expertise is of the individual person.
Yeah. So, could you talk about like any ongoing like projects or initiatives at the center that you're like particularly like excited about?
Sure. Well, I just came out with a report, which will be the foundation for a lot more work about artificial intelligence, in particular, generative artificial intelligence, which is a broad term describing systems where you can give the system a relatively brief written prompt, and it will produce almost instantaneously either prose or images or audio that both is surprising in terms of the amount of factual material you can gather, that it can be put into relatively serviceable prose, and that it can even carry on what seems like a very eerily human conversation with you. Now, in fact, it isn't really a conversation. There isn't really a fully formed human intelligence on the other side of it, but it's a very impressive simulation of that. So, as I'm sure you've read about, you may have personal experience with already, systems like ChatGPT or other apps that are based on AI so-called models or large language models that are capable of doing this. And these inventions have tremendous commercial potential. Very big companies are already combining these capabilities with their products and are expecting to make quite a bit of money off it. These are companies like Microsoft and Google, as well as smaller companies you may or may not have heard of, with names like OpenAI or Anthropic, some of which are forming alliances with the bigger companies. And you're going to see a lot more software, a lot more other kinds of technological products that have this capability. Our interest, my interest, is what risks these systems bring with them. And the risks include the tremendous degree to which these systems will make it easier to compose and disseminate mis and disinformation, rather than having to, create a false account on Facebook or TikTok or wherever, and then manually compose content for your false account to achieve whatever fraudulent end you're trying to achieve. You can ask one of these systems to compose material in the vein of a post that would be appropriate for Twitter or Facebook or a TikTok video. It will do that for you instantaneously. And if you are someone who is trying to do this across a language barrier or a cultural barrier or a geographic barrier, for example, you're somebody in Russia or Iran who wants to mess with American politics and get people arguing with each other and confused over what's true and not true, you may speak English, but your English may not be perfect, and people might be able to detect that relatively easily. Well, ChatGPT takes care of that for you because it sounds very authentic and convincing. So that's one risk. Another risk is that these systems, while they sound very authoritative and can bring together an extraordinary amount of data, they make surprising mistakes. This is called hallucination. They make things up. So they may say fact number one, fact number two, fact number three, and all of those are exactly right, but fact 4 and 5 are just completely made up, not true. And they may even attribute it to some source, a book or a legal case or something, and the book or the legal case may be made up. So this fallibility, which, by the way, the designers of these programs admit they don't fully understand why it has this tendency, is very potentially troubling, because if people start to rely on these systems, they're not going to necessarily know when the systems are making stuff up. And I think that's something that needs a tremendous amount of attention. So that's one project, looking at the unfolding of generative AI. We recently also published a report that's the basis for continuing work on the spread of extremist political ideas via gaming sites and gaming adjacent sites. So you doubtless know that, online gaming, huge industry, millions and millions of people spend a lot of time doing that stuff. Lots of fun for a lot of people. That's all great. But there's the capacity in many of these sites to chat while you're playing the games.
Mhm.
people are chatting and even taunting each other a little bit of, smack talk. Okay, that's fine. But it turns out that people who are trying to spread racist ideas, homophobic ideas, and so forth, uh, uh, have discovered that this is a venue in which they can spread their ideas relatively easily without there being any filters on it. And the audience is a potentially susceptible audience, frequently relatively young, not necessarily the most mature or the most knowledgeable people in the world. And they're already engaged in a sort of competitive and even in terms of imagery, brutal back and forth where they're blowing each other's heads off or chopping each other's heads off or whatever. Um, and this is a place where people who want to spread these extreme ideas have begun to collect and plant their ideas to see if they will uh, take hold. This is particularly a problem in so-called gaming adjacent sites. So these are sites like Discord or Twitch, where people who play games go to talk in a social media type environment or to live stream themselves talking or playing games. And these sites don't have very much content moderation. There's no one really keeping an eye on what's going on in these sites. And as a result, they've become, again, sites where a lot of extreme political ideas get spread. The topicality or the urgency of this is illustrated by the recent case in which a very young Air National Guardsman was posting to his buddies secret documents that he had access to through his work in the military. Now he's been caught and arrested, and he's going to go to prison for a long time. But he was doing this for quite a period of time on Discord, which is not a gaming site itself, but was set up by people for gamers to go to talk back and forth. And you can set up a private channel, or they call them servers on Discord. And we were able to identify quite a few of them that were set up in order to spread, white supremacist ideas and other really bad stuff. So that's another area we're going to continue to analyze the problems with online gaming. And in the future, we have a work that probably won't come out until the fall on the metaverse. So before generative AI became the talk of Silicon Valley, there was a lot of focus on the metaverse, which is shorthand for 3D immersive experiences. The best example of this that's actually active now is actually in gaming, where there are some online games that have a 3D component where people wear a headset and so forth. But the reason that the company Facebook changed its name to Meta is because the guy running the company, Mark Zuckerberg, sees the future of the company in providing 3D immersive environments, not just for games, but for everything. That this is the future of the internet, in his view and the view of a lot of other people. It hasn't come about yet, but there are a lot of companies working on that technology. And one way or the other, 3D immersive experiences are going to become more prevalent. And so we're trying to get ahead of the problem of what are the additional risks that 3D immersive activity will bring with it. And one illustration is that there'll be a degree of invasion of privacy that people have never experienced before. Right now, in order to use Facebook for free, you give Facebook access to information about yourself. And Facebook uses that information to help direct advertisers to you, to give you ads that the advertiser thinks you'll be interested in based on some of your information. So there's a certain degree, you give up a certain amount of privacy in exchange for the ability to use the system, and the system makes money by selling ads that are keyed to your private information. Well, in order to make 3D immersive technology work, the system has to gather a huge additional amount of information about you, what you react to, where your eyes go when something happens, all kinds of physical interaction between you and the system, which they don't necessarily make advertise, hey, you're giving up all this information. It's just going to be part of the new experience. And the question is, are we willing to surrender that degree of information about ourselves in order to enjoy this new opportunity to simulate a 3D experience of, you're in a classroom in Illinois, but through the system, it can seem like you're in ancient Rome, at the beginnings of debate about basic democratic ideas. Mark Zuckerberg thinks the answer is yes, that you and your teachers are going to want to do that, and in a thousand other ways that 3D experiences will be valuable, and maybe they will be valuable, but the question is at what cost. So this project is looking into sort of the hidden costs or the hidden risks that will come with 3D immersive experiences.
Yeah, those all sound really interesting. Thank you for like giving me a rundown of them.
Sure.
Um, so my Zoom has like like 2 more minutes, and I know we've gone like a little bit over than planned. So
Well,
just
another question or two is fine, then we'll call it quits.
right. If you don't have anything else to add about misinformation, I've just like two more questions just for fun.
Sure.
So the first one, so there, what inspires you in life? Like, what are some of your inspirations, like person, idea, book? And also, do you have any advice for people, especially like teens?
All right, well, I'll give it a shot. The first thing about inspiration, I certainly have a quick answer. I'm very fortunate to be married to my wife, whose name is Julie Cohen, and she is a documentary filmmaker by profession. She is by far my inspiration. So if you're fortunate enough to find somebody in life whose intelligence and good heart sweeps you off your feet, do everything you can to land that person and hang on to them. Because it's a great experience to live with your inspiration every day. It's not some distant, far off hero or person from history or celebrity. Just the person you see when you get up and you get into bed with at night. It's quite a good experience. So that's my inspiration, and I highly recommend my wife's documentaries. She's made a number of terrific movies over the years. One of the ones that's best known is about the late Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. The movie is called RBG, which are Ginsburg's initials. And Julie was nominated for an Academy Award for that movie with her directing partner. And her most recent movie, which is out in theaters right now, and soon will be on streaming, is called Everybody. And it is about the experiences of intersex people. And it's an extraordinary movie, and I highly recommend it. The other thing that is most important to me in my immediate day-to-day life is I have been since childhood an absolute fanatic about dogs, and I've always lived with dogs and find them inspirational in their own ways. And